Northern Minnesota Territory, December 1888. The first snow had already buried the settlement of Pine Ridge 3 feet deep when Olaf Henriksen began what his neighbors would later call the most wasteful construction project in frontier history. While other families huddled around their fireplaces, rationing precious cordwood against the brutal winter ahead, this Norwegian immigrant was doing something that made absolutely no sense. He was building a second house around his house. Not an addition, not a barn. A complete wooden shell that would encase his entire log cabin within a gap of empty air. When asked why, Olaf simply smiled and continued working, his breath frosting in the December cold as he measured, cut, and nailed board after board into place. The ridicule started immediately. At Sunday gatherings, men shook their heads. Women whispered. Even the children seemed to sense something was wrong with what the strange Norwegian was doing. Henriksen's gone mad, they said. Winters made him lose his senses. But Olaf had not lost anything. He had discovered something that would change how frontier families survive the killing cold of Minnesota winters. Something so simple, yet so profound, that within 2 years, it would reshape building practices across 3 counties. What did this shipwright-turned-homesteader understand about heat, moisture, and survival that everyone else had missed? Before I reveal the engineering secret that saved families from freezing and transformed frontier architecture, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Do that, and I promise you'll learn a building technique so effective that modern engineers are still rediscovering its principles today. Because what Olaf built wasn't primitive, it was brilliant. Olaf Henriksen wasn't supposed to be in Minnesota at all. Back in Bergen, Norway, he'd spent 15 years building fishing vessels, learning how hulls had to breathe, how moisture trapped between planking would rot the strongest oak, how air circulation meant the difference between a boat that lasted 5 years and one that lasted 50. When he arrived in Pine Ridge in the spring of 1887, he brought those shipbuilding instincts with him. He watched his first winter carefully. He observed, and what he saw disturbed him deeply. Every cabin in the settlement followed the same design. Tight chinked logs, a stone fireplace, maybe some mud or moss packed between the timber gaps. The families who lived in them burned enormous amounts of firewood, sometimes 8 to 10 cords per winter, and still shivered through January and February. But worse than the cold was what Olaf noticed about their firewood itself. It was wet, not soaking, but damp enough to hiss and smoke when thrown on the fire, damp enough to produce half the heat it should, damp enough to creosote up chimneys and fill cabins with acrid smoke that made children cough through the night. The wood was stored outside, under tarps or lean-tos that let wind and snow penetrate. By midwinter, even seasoned cordwood had absorbed enough moisture to compromise its burn efficiency by 30 to 40%. The families didn't understand this. They just knew they were cold, and they blamed the brutal Minnesota climate. Olaf knew better. The problem wasn't the cold outside. It was the lack of protection for the resources that fought the cold. And so, in December 1888, when his own cabin was barely a year old, he began his mad construction project. He started by surveying his existing 16 by 24-foot log cabin. Then he began erecting vertical posts exactly 3 feet out from each wall, north, south, east, and west. The posts stood 10 feet tall, sunk 2 feet into the frozen ground. Between these posts, he nailed horizontal boards, creating what looked like a second, larger cabin that completely surrounded the first. His neighbor, Jacob Lindstrom, a Swedish carpenter with 20 years of frontier experience, stopped by on the 3rd day. "Henriksen," he said, his voice carrying the patient tone of a man explaining something to a child. "You're wasting good lumber. That outer shell won't keep you any warmer. Heat doesn't care about air gaps. You just built yourself twice the wall to lose heat through." Olaf continued nailing. "Perhaps," he said simply. "We'll see come January." What Olaf was building had a name in Norwegian. Luftgap isolation, air gap insulation. But it was more than insulation. It was a complete environmental control system, disguised as a simple wooden shed. The 3-foot gap between his cabin walls and the outer boards served multiple purposes, each one engineered with the precision of a ship's hull. First, the airspace itself created a thermal buffer. Cold air from outside had to pass through the outer shell, then cross 3 feet of relatively still air before reaching the log walls of his actual home. That alone reduced direct heat loss by approximately 30%. But Olaf went further. He designed the outer structure with deliberate ventilation, small gaps at the bottom near ground level, and larger vents near the roofline. This wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. Air could flow through, but weather could not. Snow might drift against the outer boards, but it would never touch his cabin walls. Rain would hit the outer shell and drain away, never penetrating to the logs themselves. The roof of the outer structure extended 4 feet beyond the walls, creating deep eaves that shed snow and rain far from the foundation. Olaf had learned from ships. Water is the enemy of wood. Keep water away from the structure, and the structure lasts generations. Inside that 3-foot gap, Olaf began stacking his cordwood. Not randomly, but systematically. He stood each split log on end, bark side out, creating rows that allowed air to circulate between them. The wood sat protected from direct snow and rain, while the deliberate ventilation Olaf had built into the outer shell created a constant, gentle airflow that carried moisture away. Within 3 weeks of stacking, his firewood was seasoning undercover in a way his neighbors would never could. The outer boards blocked 90% of wind-driven moisture while the ventilation prevented condensation buildup. Testing with his hand, Olaf could feel the difference. His stored wood felt dry to the touch. His neighbors would felt damp, sometimes even slick with frost. The physics were simple, though Olaf might not have used those terms. Wood below 18% moisture content burns efficiently, releasing approximately 7,000 BTUs per pound. Wood above 25% moisture content, the level most of his neighbors would sat at, burns poorly, releasing perhaps 4,500 BTUs per pound while creating excessive smoke and creosote. Olaf was storing fuel that would burn 73% more efficiently than what his neighbors fed their fires. And he was doing it with construction that cost him perhaps 6 extra days of labor and 200 board feet of lumber. Lumber that would pay for itself and save firewood within a single winter. But none of his neighbors understood this yet. They just saw a man who'd wrapped his house in what looked like an oversized shed, and they thought him foolish. By Christmas 1888, Olaf's double-shell construction was complete, and Pine Ridge had reached a consensus. Henriksen had built the stupidest structure anyone had ever seen. At the settlement's holiday gathering, the ridicule became public. Jacob Lindström, the Swedish carpenter, stood before the assembled families and did the mathematics for everyone to see. That Norwegian, he announced, gesturing with his pipe, has used 43% more lumber than his cabin required. 43%. He's got enough wood in that outer shell to have built a proper barn, or a summer kitchen, or a smokehouse. Instead, he's got air. 3 feet of empty air. The crowd murmured agreement. Resources on the frontier weren't abundant. Every nail, every board, every ounce of labor had to count. Waste was almost sinful. An experienced builder named William Hutchins, who'd constructed 17 cabins across the Minnesota territory, shook his head slowly. I've built through winters where men lost fingers to frostbite while working, he said. I've chinked logs so tight you couldn't slide a knife blade between them. That man's outer boards are loose. I can see gaps from here. He'll freeze worse than any of us, and he'll have wasted good lumber doing it. Even the settlement's minister, Reverend Amos Pritchard, weighed in during a sermon. While he didn't name Olaf directly, his meaning was clear. The Lord values wise stewardship of resources. He does not favor those who build grand monuments to their own vanity while practical needs go unmet. Olaf's wife, Ingrid, felt the social pressure most acutely. At the women's quilting circle, conversations would quiet when she entered. One afternoon, Martha Lindström, Jacob's wife, spoke what others were thinking. Ingrid, dear, you must talk sense to your husband. My Jacob says the structure won't even keep you warmer. It's just more wall for heat to escape through. All that work, all that lumber for nothing. Ingrid, who had watched Olaf calculate and measure and adjust his plans for months, simply smiled. "We'll see," she said quietly. "Winter will tell us what's wise and what's foolish." But privately, even Ingrid had moments of doubt. The outer structure had cost them $240 in lumber and nails, nearly half their annual income. If Olaf was wrong, if the ridicule was justified, they would be financially crippled and socially humiliated. Every time she looked at the strange double-walled building, she felt a flutter of anxiety. Olaf himself seemed unbothered by the criticism. He continued his preparations, now stacking cordwood in the gap between the walls with the same methodical precision he'd used in the construction. When neighbors passed and made jokes, "Building a house for your firewood, Henriksen," or "Next you'll put a roof on your wood pile," he simply nodded and continued working. What his neighbors didn't know was that Olaf had been keeping careful records. Each day, he noted the temperature, the wind direction, the humidity. He measured the moisture content of his stored wood using a simple technique he'd learned on the docks, weighing sample pieces, then checking them again days later. His wood was drying, steadily, measurably drying, even in the depths of winter. Their wood was not. But proof wouldn't come from measurements or explanations. Proof would come from survival. And in January 1890, proof was about to arrive with brutal, undeniable force. If you're fascinated by this frontier engineering story, hit that like button, subscribe for more forgotten survival wisdom, and comment below. What's the coldest temperature you've ever experienced? Let's see who's really tested their winter survival skills. January 17th, 1890, began with an eerie stillness. The wind that had howled across Pine Ridge for weeks suddenly died. The sky turned a peculiar pale color that old-timers recognized immediately. "Storm coming," they muttered. "Bad one." They were wrong. It wasn't just bad. It was catastrophic. The blizzard that struck on January 18th came with winds exceeding 60 miles per hour and temperatures that plunged to 37 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, negative 38 Celsius. Snow didn't fall so much as it exploded horizontally, driven by winds so fierce that men couldn't stand upright, couldn't see their hands before their faces, couldn't breathe without wrapping cloth over their mouths. For 3 days, Pine Ridge was cut off from the world. Families huddled in their cabins, feeding their fires constantly, burning through their carefully hoarded cordwood at terrifying rates. The cold was so severe that water froze within minutes of being drawn from wells. Breath crystallized on beards. Windows frosted over with ice thick enough to block all outside light. In the Lindstrom cabin, Jacob fed the fireplace every 20 minutes, pulling wood from his outdoor lean-to through a passage he dug through the snow. The wood was frozen solid, coated with ice and snow. When he threw it on the fire, it hissed and steamed, producing more smoke than heat. The cabin temperature hovered around 52 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that the family slept in their winter coats, cold enough that Ingrid Lindstrom's hands trembled as she tried to cook. In the Hutchins household, the situation was even worse. William had run low on firewood by the second day and was burning greenwood cut just weeks before, wood with moisture content above 35%. The fire smoldered more than burned. Temperatures inside dropped to 48 degrees. His youngest daughter, only 6 years old, developed a deep cough that wouldn't stop. But in the Henriksen cabin, something different was happening. Olaf had awakened the first morning of the storm and walked calmly to his outer structure. The wind screamed outside, but within the 3-foot gap between his cabin and the outer shell, the air was merely moving, not raging. He selected dry wood from his stored stacks, wood that had been seasoning in this protected space for over a year now. The pieces felt light in his hands, properly cured, with moisture content below 15%. He carried an armload inside and built his fire. The wood caught immediately, burning hot and clean with minimal smoke. The flames roared up the chimney with the bright, intense heat that only truly dry wood can produce. By mid-morning, his cabin had reached 68 degrees Fahrenheit. By afternoon, it held steady at 70 degrees. The stone hearth Olaf had built absorbed the heat and radiated it back throughout the day and night. He fed the fire every 45 minutes instead of every 20. His carefully stacked cordwood, protected from the elements, was performing exactly as he'd calculated it would. On the afternoon of the second day, through a brief lull in the storm, Jacob Lindstrom struggled through chest-deep snow to check on the Henriksons. He expected to find them suffering like everyone else, perhaps worse given that foolish double-wall construction. Instead, when Olaf opened the door, a wave of genuine warmth rolled out into the frigid air. Jacob stood stunned in the doorway. The cabin was warm, actually warm. Ingrid was cooking without her coat. The children were playing on the floor in their regular clothes. The fire burned steadily in the hearth, and beside it, Olaf had stacked perhaps 20 pieces of dry firewood. "Ow!" Jacob asked simply, his voice barely a whisper. Olaf gestured toward the outer structure, where rows of seasoned cordwood stood protected from the killing cold, the wind, the ice. "The wood stays dry," he said. "Dry wood burns hot. Hot fire needs less fuel. Simple." Jacob stood silent, calculations running through his mind. He'd already burned through 2 full cords in just 2 days. At this rate, he'd run out of wood before February ended. And his wood was getting wetter, not drier, every time he pulled it from his snow-covered lean-to. "That gap," Jacob said slowly. "It's not just insulation. It's storage, protection, your whole winter supply, seasoning under cover." "Yes," Olaf said. "And the airspace keeps the cabin walls dry too. No frost, no rot. This cabin will last 50 years, maybe more." Jacob returned to his own freezing cabin that afternoon with a new understanding. He'd been wrong. They'd all been wrong. But pride is a difficult thing to surrender, and he said nothing to the others. Not yet. The storm broke on the 4th day. When families emerged to assess the damage, they found Pine Ridge transformed. Snow drifts reached the eaves of some cabins. Livestock had perished, and cordwood supplies across the settlement had been devastated. Not just burned through, but ruined. Wood that had been stored outside was now ice-logged, frozen solid, nearly impossible to burn effectively. Olaf Henriksen stepped from his double-shell structure with his children, all of them warm and well-fed. His firewood supply remained abundant, dry, and ready. He consumed perhaps 1.5 cords during the storm, half what his neighbors had burned. The questions began that very afternoon. Word of the Henriksen family's remarkable comfort during the blizzard spread quickly through Pine Ridge, but skepticism died hard. People needed proof, not stories, not impressions, but measurable, undeniable evidence that Olaf's foolish construction was actually superior. Jacob Lindstrom, the carpenter who'd been Olaf's harshest critic, decided to conduct a proper investigation. On February 3rd, 1890, 2 weeks after the Great Storm, he arrived at the Henriksen homestead with a proposal. "I want to measure everything," he told Olaf. "Temperature, wood consumption, moisture, everything. And I want to compare it to my own cabin under identical conditions." Olaf agreed immediately. He'd been keeping his own records since the structure's completion, but having an independent witness, especially one who'd publicly doubted him, would carry far more weight with the community. For the next 3 weeks, Jacob made daily visits. He brought a spirit thermometer he'd ordered from Minneapolis, accurate to within 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Each morning at sunrise, noon, and sunset, he recorded temperatures in both cabins. The results were stunning. The Henriksen cabin maintained an average interior temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the measurement period. The Lindstrom cabin, of comparable size and with a similar stone fireplace, averaged 54 degrees. That 14-degree difference represented a massive improvement in livability, the difference between genuine comfort and mere survival. But temperature was only part of the story. Jacob also tracked firewood consumption with meticulous precision. He counted every log, measured the diameter and length of each piece, and calculated volume. Over those 3 February weeks, the Henriksen household burned through approximately 3/4 of a cord of wood. The Lindstrom household, trying to maintain similar temperatures, consumed 1 3/4 cords, more than double. The mathematics were irrefutable. Extrapolated across a full winter season, Olaf would burn roughly 4 cords of firewood to maintain comfort. Jacob's family would burn 9 cords for comparable warmth. In a region where cordwood sold for $6 per cord, that represented a savings of $30 per winter, enough to buy a milk cow or a full year's supply of flour or the lumber for a barn. But perhaps most revealing was the moisture content analysis. Jacob selected random pieces from both wood piles and weighed them carefully on a merchant scale. Then he split the pieces and examined the interior wood. Olaf's cordwood, stored in the protected gap of his double shell structure, showed moisture content between 12 and 15%. Jacob's wood, pulled from his outdoor lean-to, tested between 26 and 32% moisture. Jacob knew enough about combustion to understand what this meant. Wetwood doesn't just burn poorly, it actively works against the fire. Every pound of water in the wood requires approximately 1,000 BTUs of heat energy just to evaporate before the wood itself can begin burning. The Lindstrom family wasn't just burning wood, they were burning wood to dry, wood to burn wood. It was hideously inefficient. On February 24th, Jacob presented his findings to a gathering at the settlement's community hall. 37 people attended, nearly every adult in Pine Ridge. Jacob stood before them with his notebook, his measurements, his calculations. "I was wrong," he began simply. "Henrikson's construction is not wasteful. It's brilliant." He walked them through the numbers. The temperature differential, the fuel savings, the moisture content comparisons. He explained the thermal buffer principle, how the 3-foot air gap reduced direct heat loss. He described how the protected storage kept firewood dry and burnable at peak efficiency. William Hutchins, the experienced builder who'd mocked the design, raised his hand. "But, Jacob, that still doesn't change the fact that he used 40% more lumber. Even with the fuel savings, it'll take years to recoup the construction cost." Jacob shook his head. "I calculated that too, William. At current cordwood prices and current lumber costs, the structure pays for itself in saved fuel within 3 winters. After that, it's pure savings, $30 a year, every year, for as long as the building stands. And that's not even counting the other benefits." "What other benefits?" Someone called from back. "The outer structure serves as a workshop," Jacob explained. "Henriksen repairs tools there, shelters equipment, even keeps a small forge running when needed. The space isn't wasted, it's multi-purpose. And the dry storage doesn't just apply to firewood. He stores grain there, leather goods, anything that needs protection from moisture. The whole design is integrated, purposeful." He paused, then added, "And here's something else I noticed. His cabin walls themselves show no frost damage. No ice accumulation between the logs. No rot starting at the foundation. That double shell keeps the cabin structure dry and protected. My cabin? I've already got moisture problems in the northwest corner. His cabin could last 50 years. Mine might need major repairs in 10. The room fell silent as people absorbed this information. Olaf, sitting quietly in the back, said nothing. He'd known these things all along, but hearing Jacob, his most vocal critic, present the evidence carried weight that his own words never could have. Martha Hutchins spoke up, her voice hesitant. "My daughter's cough, the one she got during the storm, it hasn't gone away. The doctor in St. Cloud says it's from breathing smoke and damp air. Says our cabin's too cold and the fire smoke's too much from wetwood." She looked at Olaf. "Your children didn't get sick at all, did they?" "No," Olaf said simply. "Drywood burns clean. Clean fire makes less smoke. And warmth helps people stay healthy." That statement hung in the air like a verdict. This wasn't just about comfort or fuel economy anymore. This was about children's health, about families surviving Minnesota winters without illness, without suffering, without the constant anxiety of running out of firewood or watching their stored wood turn to ice-logged uselessness. One by one, men began approaching Olaf after the meeting. "Would you help me build one? Could you show me the measurements? What would it cost in lumber?" The Norwegian shipwright who'd been called mad, wasteful, and foolish was suddenly the most sought-after builder in Pine Ridge. By late spring of 1890, Olaf Henriksen had helped design double-shell structures for 12 families in Pine Ridge. He didn't charge for his expertise. He considered it community knowledge, something that should be shared freely. But the families insisted on compensating him somehow, and Olaf found himself with offers of labor, livestock, grain, and goodwill that made his homestead more prosperous than he'd ever imagined. Jacob Lindström became Olof's most dedicated student and advocate. The Swedish carpenter began incorporating the double shell principle into every cabin he built, modifying the design slightly for different sizes and purposes. By the winter of 1891 to 92, 23 families within a 50-mile radius of Pine Ridge were living in variations of what they'd begun calling shed houses or Norwegian doubles. The technique spread through the Scandinavian immigrant communities first. They recognized the design principle from traditional Norwegian and Swedish building methods adapted to Minnesota's extreme conditions. But soon, even American-born settlers who'd initially mocked the concept were adopting it. The evidence was simply too compelling to ignore. Word reached the Minnesota Agricultural Extension Service in St. Paul by 1893. A field agent named Robert Whitmore traveled to Pine Ridge specifically to document the shed house phenomenon. His report, published in the 1894 Minnesota Farm Almanac, included detailed drawings, measurements, and testimonials. Whitmore calculated that the average shed house reduced winter fuel consumption by 52% compared to standard frontier cabins, while improving interior comfort and extending the lifespan of the primary structure. The report noted something else significant. Families living in shed houses reported fewer respiratory illnesses during winter months. The combination of warmer interior temperatures and cleaner burning fires from properly dried wood created healthier living conditions. Childhood mortality from winter-related illnesses in shed house families was measurably lower than in families living in traditional single-wall cabins. But perhaps the most remarkable legacy of Olof's innovation was how it influenced modern building science. The principle he employed, using an air gap and protective outer shell to manage moisture and provide thermal buffering, is fundamentally identical to what modern engineers call a rain screen or ventilated facade. Contemporary building codes now recommend or require similar designs for long-term structural durability and energy efficiency. The double-wall construction with air gap insulation that Olof built in 1888 anticipated by nearly a century what building scientists would discover in the 1970s and 1980s. What frontier neighbors called wasteful and foolish turned out to be profoundly advanced engineering disguised in simple lumber and common sense. Olof himself never promoted his design as revolutionary. When asked about it in later years, he shrugged and said, "In Bergen, boats that don't breathe rot within 5 years. Houses are the same. Keep the wood dry, let the air move, protect what needs protecting. This isn't new. It's just correct." He lived in his shed house until his death in 1924 at the age of 73. The structure stood solid and sound, requiring minimal maintenance over those 36 years. His children inherited it, and their children after them. The Henriksen shed house remained occupied until 1967, when it was finally dismantled, not because it had failed, but because the family wanted to build something larger and more modern. When workers took apart the outer shell, they found the original log cabin inside in nearly perfect condition. The logs showed no rot, no insect damage, no structural compromise. The foundation stones were as solid as the day they'd been laid. 80 years of Minnesota weather, blizzards, heat waves, torrential rains, brutal winds, had barely touched the protected core of the building. Today, only 3 of the original Pine Ridge shed houses remain standing. One serves as a museum managed by the Minnesota Historical Society. Visitors walk through it year-round, experiencing firsthand how a simple air gap and protected storage can transform a frontier cabin into a genuinely comfortable home. During winter demonstrations, museum staff light fires in the original hearth using dry wood stored in the outer gap, just as Olof did. The temperature differential between inside and outside is still impressive, often 30 to 40 degrees. The museum's interpretive materials make a point that Olof himself understood intuitively, but never articulated in quite these terms. Innovation doesn't always mean new technology or complex systems. Sometimes it means paying attention to principles that have worked for centuries, then applying them thoughtfully to new challenges. The men who laughed at Olaf in 1888 weren't stupid or malicious. They were simply trapped in assumptions. Assumptions that more lumber meant waste, that traditional single-wall construction was tried and true, that a Norwegian immigrant shipwright couldn't possibly understand Minnesota winters better than they did. Hit that like button if this story changed how you think about building and insulation. Subscribe for more forgotten frontier wisdom that still works today, and drop a comment. Would you build a shed house if you were homesteading in a cold climate? I read every comment and love hearing your thoughts. What Olaf proved wasn't that his neighbors were ignorant. He proved something more profound and more humbling. That dismissing unfamiliar approaches without testing them, that confusing simple with primitive, that assuming traditional knowledge has nothing to teach modern minds. These are errors that every generation repeats. The shed house stands as a monument to a different kind of wisdom. Not the wisdom of complexity, but the wisdom of observation. Not the wisdom of expensive materials, but the wisdom of understanding how heat, moisture, and air actually behave. Not the wisdom of following convention, but the wisdom of asking whether convention actually works. In February 1890, when Jacob Lindstrom stood before his neighbors and admitted he'd been wrong, he did something remarkably brave. He let evidence overrule his ego. He let measurements matter more than his reputation. He chose truth over pride. That choice, repeated by dozens of families over the following years, turned a foolish construction project into a regional building tradition that saved fuel, protected health, and sheltered families through some of the harshest winters the Minnesota frontier ever knew. The neighbors stopped laughing, and they started learning. Because sometimes the person everyone calls crazy is the only one who actually understands what's happening. Sometimes what looks like waste is actually investment. And sometimes building a shed around your house isn't madness. It's exactly what survival requires. Educational note. This script presents historical frontier building techniques for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering principles described are sound and based on real physics, modern construction should always follow current building codes, safety standards, and professional engineering guidance. The shed house design represents historical adaptation to specific frontier conditions and should not be replicated without proper consultation with licensed builders and compliance with local regulations.